A murder. One witness. Every answer hidden in riddles. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Join the mystery, leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. You make this space feel alive. Thank you for being here. It was one of those rare London mornings when the fog rose like a reluctant curtain revealing the city in patches, chimney stacks, steeples and gas lamps emerging gradually from a gauzy veil. I had just settled into my armchair at 21B Baker Street, a cup of scalding tea in hand, when Miss Hudson's soft knock preceded her announcement. "A gentleman to see Mr. Holmes. Urgent," he says, "and very particular." Before I could rise to respond, Sherlock Holmes himself stepped from his bedroom in a dressing gown that had seen better days, fastening it at the waist with distracted fingers. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he called briskly, "and kindly have some more coffee sent up. This sounds like a case worthy of caffeine." The visitor entered moments later, a man of about 40, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven and strikingly pale, as though he had been roused from bed by some awful event. His eyes darted to the windows, then to the corners of the room with the nervous caution of one pursued. "I am Captain Percival Ashcroft of the Honorable East India Company," he said, offering Holmes a tight nod and barely glancing in my direction. "I was referred to you by Inspector Lestrade. There's been a murder." Holmes steepled his fingers and gestured for the man to sit. "Murder is rarely punctual, Captain. What makes this one worthy of my attention?" Ashcroft leaned forward. "Because the only witness is a lunatic who speaks in riddles." At this, Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Now that is interesting." The captain, who smelled faintly of sea salt and cloves, composed himself with effort and began. "The incident occurred last night at Ashcroft House, my family's ancestral estate in Hampstead. A house guest, Mr. Julian Frobisher, was found dead in the library, his skull fractured by a heavy bronze candlestick. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, and no one heard a struggle. I had taken out my notebook by now, for I knew Holmes would want every detail preserved. "Who discovered the body?" Holmes asked. "A maid, Miss Clarissa Wren, who was bringing him his evening tisane. She screamed, of course, and woke the household. The police were called." Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully, "and the riddle-spouting witness, an old friend of the family, Mr. Ambrose Godwin. He's been peculiar for years. Something happened to him during his time in India. He speaks in cryptic verse, nonsensical rhymes and peculiar aphorisms. He was seen walking the hall outside the library minutes before the body was found." "And what, pray, did Mr. Godwin say?" Ashcroft hesitated. "He said, 'The moon weeps silver on crimson wood, where knowledge bled and silence stood. Seek not the thief, but the gift returned, lest ash reveal what never burned.'" There was a long silence. Holmes broke it with a sharp laugh. "My dear Watson," he said, "do you recall my theory that madness is sometimes but genius misunderstood? I should very much like to meet Mr. Godwin." Ashcroft appeared startled. "You believe he has value to the investigation?" Holmes rose, already reaching for his coat. "If he has witnessed a crime and chosen riddles as his tongue, then he is not mad, but cautious or clever, possibly both." "Inspector Lestrade is already at the estate," Ashcroft added, standing with obvious relief. "He's eager to close the case, naturally. The candlestick bears smudged fingerprints, and nothing more." Holmes stopped short as he retrieved his gloves. "Smudged, you say? Curious. One either wipes fingerprints clean or leaves them in full. Smudging implies hesitation, or artifice." He turned to me. "Watson, bring your revolver. This has the scent of subtlety and danger." As we descended the steps, I whispered, "Holmes, do you truly think the riddles have meaning?" "My dear fellow," he said, eyes gleaming, "all speech has meaning when uttered at a crime scene." As the cab rattled through the narrow lanes of North London, the damp breath of the city clung to the windows, painting them in condensation that distorted the gaslights outside into glowing smears. Holmes sat across from me, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, not sleeping, but listening, it seemed, to some inner refrain only he could hear. I refrained from breaking the silence, sensing that he was already 10 steps ahead, building unseen scaffolding in his mind. "Watson," he said at last, "consider this riddle. Seek not the thief, but the gift returned." What would you make of that? "It sounds poetic," I replied cautiously. "Perhaps metaphorical. Could the murderer have returned something to the victim, Excellent, he murmured, and the line preceding it, the moon weeps silver on crimson wood, a vivid image. Crimson wood could be blood upon polished mahogany. And the moon's reflection might suggest a time night or perhaps the positioning of a window. Mr. Ambrose Godwin may be mad, but his madness is curiously precise. Before I could reply, Holmes straightened and knocked twice on the roof of the cab. The vehicle slowed, then turned up a broad drive flanked by frost-rimmed hedges. Ashcroft House emerged from the haze, a stately Georgian manor of grey brick, its windows lit by the cold flicker of gaslight. A policeman waited by the heavy oak door, cap already in hand. Inside, Captain Ashcroft led us through a dim corridor, hung with oil portraits. The hush of the house was oppressive, as though sound itself dared not disturb its gloom. "The library is this way," Ashcroft said, pausing before an archway, "and Mr. Godwin is in the conservatory under observation. I'd be obliged if you spoke with him after seeing the body." Holmes nodded. "Watson, attend me." The library smelled of leather and beeswax, though another scent lingered faintly beneath a sour tang of old blood. The room was orderly, but the area before the hearth had been hastily roped off. A large bloodstain marred the edge of a worn Persian rug, and beside it, lying on a silver salver, rested the murder weapon, a heavy bronze candlestick, its base crusted with dried crimson. Holmes crouched, examining it without touching. No broken wax, he noted softly. So the candlestick was not lit when used. Interesting. And see here. He pointed to a faint, streaked mark on the wooden floorboards near the rug. A smear, not a drop, as if someone dragged something or someone briefly across the floor. Yet there is no trail continuing from it. Curious. I bent to see. Perhaps the body was shifted slightly before the police arrived. Perhaps, or someone tried to alter the scene in a hurry. Do you see, Watson, how the chairs are all slightly out of alignment, except that one near the window? I followed his gaze. A high-backed chair faced the fire, its arm delicately carved, its position suggesting someone had sat there recently. Holmes moved toward the bookshelves next, his fingers gliding over the bindings. He paused at a lower shelf and plucked out a small cloth-bound volume. Flipping through it, he produced a scrap of torn paper tucked between the pages. He read it silently, his mouth curving into something between amusement and fascination, then passed it to me. The paper read, "When eyes are blind, the mouth must lie, but hands remember what minds deny." I looked up. Another riddle, or a warning. One must ask who placed it there and why. He returned the paper to the book and reshelved it. At that moment, Lestrade appeared in the doorway, rubbing his hands briskly. "Holmes, glad to see you, though I doubt you'll do better than what we've already got. Circumstantial as it is, it's clean enough for the Crown." Holmes turned. "Then I imagine you're preparing to arrest the mad poet." Lestrade gave a dry snort. "Godwin? No, not unless we find his fingerprints on the candlestick, and I doubt we shall. More likely it's one of the servants. That maid who found the body, nervous sort. Too nervous, if you ask me." Holmes offered no reply, only an inscrutable glance, and turned back to the bloodstain. "I take it you've already interviewed everyone." "Twice. Got the statements written out in my bag." "I should like to see them." Lestrade huffed but agreed. "Very well. They're in the drawing room. I'll fetch them." As the inspector left, Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace. There he knelt once more and examined the andir and ashes carefully. After a moment, he plucked something small from the grate with a pair of tongs and held it up. It was a burned scrap of thick parchment, blackened at the edges, but bearing faint lines of what might once have been writing, ink blurred and unreadable. "Watson," he said, "our victim may have been attempting to destroy something. Perhaps a letter, perhaps more." The mystery deepened. He stood. "Let us speak with Mr. Godwin." Ashcroft led us through a glass-paneled corridor into the conservatory, where ferns drooped languidly and moisture clung to the panes. Sitting beneath a potted palm, with a wool shawl draped over his shoulders and a blanket over his knees, was Mr. Ambrose Godwin. He was a slender man, perhaps in his 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the eyes of someone who had seen both too much and not enough. He looked up as we approached and smiled faintly. "Ah," he said, "the hound and the hawk arrived. One with a wound, one with wings of thought." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Godwin, we understand you may have seen something last night." Godwin chuckled. "We all see things, sir, but few remember rightly, and fewer still speak truth. Holmes sat beside him. Then let us trade nonsense for sense. What did you mean when you spoke of the moon and crimson wood? The old man's expression shifted, becoming almost lucid. The moon saw it first. Through the high glass. A struggle, a blow. The wood drank red, but not all the blood was his. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Not all the blood belonged to Mr. Frobisher. Godwin looked away. Ashes whisper louder than screams, and the gift returned. The old man tapped his temple. You'll find it, but it won't look like a gift when you do. I leaned toward Holmes. Surely he's just raving. But Holmes rose and addressed him with sudden sharpness. Mr. Godwin, one last question. Where were you between 9 and 10 o'clock last night? The old man's face turned grave. Following shadows, one with a secret, the other with a key. Holmes regarded him a moment longer, then nodded. Thank you. We withdrew into the corridor. I was about to speak when Holmes raised a hand. Watson, we must examine the layout of the house, particularly the windows. To what end? To determine whether the moon truly could have seen the crime. He turned, already striding down the corridor, his steps quickening with purpose. And Watson, he called over his shoulder, remind me to ask Ashcroft about any missing item. I suspect something of value has been taken, but not for its worth. We followed the trail of shadows deeper into Ashcroft House, the riddle of the witness lingering behind us like the echo of a half-remembered poem. Holmes moved through Ashcroft House, like a man chasing a scent only he could perceive, his sharp gaze flicking from floor to ceiling, pausing at doorframes, skirting rugs, noting each subtle disturbance in the environment. I followed close behind, struggling to make sense of what drew his attention. We ascended the staircase to the upper floor, where the corridor curved slightly to the left, and offered a commanding view through a tall window that overlooked the rear garden. The moon would have been nearly full last night, its light falling unimpeded across the narrow path that led to the conservatory. Holmes paused there. Look, he murmured, pointing to a thin trail of dried mud crossing the carpet, a faint line no more than a few inches wide. It continues along the edge here, and see the scuff on the skirting board. Someone passed this way recently, and not carefully. I bent down. But this hallway isn't on the path to the library. Precisely, which begs the question, why would anyone avoid the direct route unless they wish to remain unseen? We followed the trail to a side room with the door ajar. Inside, a writing desk stood against the window, and next to it, a small trunk with a broken latch. Holmes examined it briefly, and then opened the desk drawers, rummaging with methodical precision. After a moment, he withdrew a small envelope, unsealed and empty. He turned it over, noting the seal impression still visible in the wax residue. Watson, do you recognize the crest? I took the envelope from him. A serpent twined around a staff, ancient in design, almost Greco-Roman in its stylization. I don't, I admitted, but it looks medical, perhaps apothecary-related. Holmes nodded slowly. Possibly, more likely alchemical, or secretive by design. Note the use of black wax, very rare. Whoever sent this message did not intend it to be kept. Then why wasn't it destroyed? Perhaps it was meant to be, but someone interrupted. And the trunk, its latch appears to have been forced recently. Ashcroft mentioned nothing about a burglary, which suggests he is either unaware of this, or concealing it. We exited the room and descended once again to the main floor, where Lestrade met us in the drawing room, with a folder of statements and a mug of tepid tea in his hand. He looked at Holmes with growing wariness. Find something? Possibly. Holmes replied, taking the folder and leafing through its contents without sitting. Miss Clarissa Wren, the maid. I should like to speak with her. Alone. Lestrade blinked. You suspect her? Holmes gave him a pointed look. I suspect that you suspect her. I merely wish to test a theory. A few minutes later, a slender girl of about 20 entered, her dark hair pinned hastily, her face pale but composed. She curtsied briefly. You sent for me? Yes, Miss Wren, Holmes said gently, motioning for her to sit. You discovered Mr. Frobisher's body? Yes, sir. And where were you just prior to that moment? I was in the kitchen. Mrs. Holloway, the cook, had just handed me the tray. I took the tisane up as I always do at 9:30. I knocked twice, and when he didn't answer, I pushed open the door and saw. She broke off, swallowing hard. Holmes leaned forward. You saw him lying by the hearth? She nodded. Yes, sir. There was blood on the rug. Did you touch anything? No. I ran straight to the captain's room and told him.
Miss Wren, Holmes said, lowering his voice slightly. Are you certain the door was closed? Yes, sir. Quite. He paused. Would you say Mr. Frobisher was well liked in the house? She hesitated, then said, he kept to himself, polite mostly, but odd. He asked strange questions. Holmes raised an eyebrow. What sort of questions? About family secrets, old debts, even the staff's habits. I thought he was writing a book. Holmes thanked her, and she departed quietly, wringing her hands in her apron as she exited. He turned to Lestrade and me. She's frightened, but she's telling the truth, he said. Mr. Frobisher was prying. I believe he discovered something, perhaps something about the contents of that stolen envelope. Lestrade frowned. You think the motive was blackmail? I think the motive was knowledge, and the danger it posed. We returned to the library, and Holmes stood before the bookshelves once more. Watson, tell me, what do you recall of Captain Ashcroft's India connection? He said he was with the East India Company, retired I believe, family wealth, old estate, perhaps an inheritance. Holmes ran his finger along the spines of a lower shelf, then abruptly stopped. Curious. He pulled out a thick volume titled Memoirs of a Bengal Cavalry Officer, opened it, and from between the pages slid a letter creased, yellowed with age, but intact. Holmes unfolded it carefully, scanning it in silence before passing it to me. It was addressed to Percival Ashcroft, dated 13 years prior. The sender was a man named Wentham, and the contents referred obliquely to the affair near Jalgaon, and the regrettable incident with the interpreter. I looked up, puzzled. Jalgaon, that's in Maharashtra. What do you suppose happened there? Holmes took the letter back and folded it crisply. Whatever it was, Captain Ashcroft wanted it hidden, and Mr. Frobisher appears to have found it. Then this was about silence, perhaps, or guilt, or fear of exposure. A sudden knock interrupted us. A butler entered with impeccable poise. Captain Ashcroft requests your presence in his study, Mr. Holmes. He says it is urgent. We followed the butler to a grand chamber lined with dark wood, and illuminated by a desk lamp, casting long shadows. Ashcroft stood near the hearth, face drawn. There's something I didn't mention, he began heavily, and I regret it now. Holmes said nothing, only waited. Earlier that evening, Frobisher confronted me. He'd found that letter you now hold. He accused me of something I deeply regret. There was an incident in India, a misunderstanding involving a translator accused of treason. I signed a recommendation that led to his execution. He paused, grimacing. Frobisher claimed the man had been innocent, and that I had suppressed evidence to the contrary. Holmes's eyes were unreadable. Was he correct? I don't know. Perhaps. I was young, ambitious. I didn't dig too deeply. Holmes paced a few steps in silence. And the letter, he said he had more copies, names, statements from others who were there. Said he'd bring the past to light. I thought he meant a biography. I didn't think. Holmes stopped. Did he threaten you? Only with the truth. And you? Only with the truth. And you? Only with...
Holmes turned toward the door. Truth, when buried, has a habit of unearthing itself. Captain, tell me, does your family own any rare artifacts from India? Ashcroft blinked. Yes. Several. Why? Because I believe something was taken last night that no one has yet noticed. Something small, easy to conceal, but priceless to the right buyer, or dangerous in the wrong hands. As we returned to the corridor, I turned to Holmes. Do you believe Ashcroft? I believe he's frightened, Holmes said. Which makes him all the more useful. But this case isn't about Ashcroft. It's about someone who knew what Frobisher discovered, perhaps before even Frobisher did. And who would that be? Holmes gave me a rare, grim smile. The one who left no footprints, no confession, and no riddle. We moved deeper into the house once more, chasing silence, shadows, and a ghost that had yet to speak. Lestrade approached at a brisk pace, a folded sheet in one hand, and a scowl settling on his features like a mask he wore too comfortably. I've just come from questioning the staff again, he said. One of them's been hiding something. Holmes turned, not slowing. Which one? The butler, Reginald Pierce. Says he was in his quarters all evening, but a footman saw him leaving the cellar door around 9:30. That places him near the library just before the body was discovered. Holmes halted mid-stride. The cellar, is it connected by corridor to the West Hall? Lestrade nodded. leads straight beneath the study and opens behind the servant's stair. Pierce could have reached the library without being seen. Has the cellar been searched? I was about to. No. Holmes cut in. Let us accompany you. We followed Lestrade down the narrow servant's stairwell, the air growing noticeably cooler as we descended. The cellar was dry, lined with wine racks and crates, and lit by a single oil lamp hanging from a beam. The scent of damp stone mingled with dust, and something fainter, metallic, sharp, fleeting. Holmes swept the chamber with a glance, then approached a heavy crate half hidden behind a curtain of hanging burlap. He crouched and examined the latch. It's been opened recently, he murmured, and hastily resealed. He worked the lid loose and lifted it. Inside, beneath a stack of linen cloths, lay several items, a folded rug, a candle mold, and beneath them, something darker. He removed a small object and held it to the light, an ornamental dagger. Its blade was no longer than a man's hand, its hilt inlaid with tiny rubies forming a stylized cobra. There was dried blood on the edge. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Well, that does it. Pierce is our man. No business having that, especially bloodied. Looks ceremonial. Stolen from the Ashcroft collection, no doubt. Holmes turned the blade over thoughtfully. The blood is real, yes, and yet not fresh. This was not the murder weapon. The wound on Mr. Frobisher's skull was blunt, crushing. This blade could pierce, but not bludgeon. So what was he doing hiding it? That, Inspector, is precisely the question we must answer before placing the noose around any neck. Just then, a sound echoed faintly. A soft footfall on the stair. We turned to see Reginald Pierce himself at the top, a lantern in one hand, his expression stony. I was told you were down here, he said quietly. I assume you've found it. Holmes stepped forward. Why did you conceal it? Pierce's face remained unreadable. Because it's cursed, Lestrade scoffed. Oh, come now. No, Holmes said, raising a hand. Let him speak. Pierce descended, his voice calm, unhurried. The dagger belonged to a priest of Cali, brought back from India by Mr. Ashcroft's grandfather. It's been locked away since before my time. 3 years ago, during a gathering much like this one, a guest stole it as a lark. The next day he was found drowned in his bath, though the door was locked from the inside. They called it coincidence. I did not. He looked down at the dagger in Holmes' hand. When I found the cabinet open yesterday morning, I feared it had been taken again. I found it in the hallway behind the study, wrapped in a cloth. I didn't know who had it, or why, but I knew enough not to mention it. Because you feared what? Holmes asked. That it had been you. Holmes met his eyes. Did you kill Julian Frobisher? Pierce shook his head slowly. No, I served him supper in the drawing room just after 9. He was quiet, thoughtful. He asked questions about the old wing, about a door that no longer opens. I answered as best I could. Then I left. That was the last I saw of him. Lestrade opened his mouth, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. Mr. Pierce, did you inform Captain Ashcroft of what you found? A pause. No. Why not? Pierce looked at us both evenly. Because this house has its secret, and some are not mine to expose. Holmes said nothing more. He took the dagger, wrapped it carefully in cloth, and tucked it beneath his arm. We returned to the main floor in silence. The atmosphere in Ashcroft House had shifted subtly. Something had stirred, something old and long dormant. Holmes made no move to confront Ashcroft, nor did he return to the library. Instead, he asked that we be shown to the old wing. Ashcroft protested mildly, but relented. The hallway that led there was dim, unused, thick with the scent of time. At its end stood a door warped with age, its brass handle dulled to green. It hasn't opened in years, Ashcroft said, trailing behind us. The wing was sealed after my father died. Dry rot, we thought. Or rats. No one's gone through since. Holmes inspected the door's frame, then reached into his coat and withdrew a small blade. With care, he chipped away a sliver of wood near the lock. Fresh splinters fell. It's been opened recently, he said. The frame is cracked. And look here, scrape marks on the floor. Someone pried it loose. With a short, forceful push, Holmes threw his shoulder into the door. The latch gave way with a groan, and the door swung open. The air that issued forth was still, but not stale. It carried a faint odor of incense, and something else, a metallic sharpness, not unlike the cellar. Inside was a study, dustless, recently used. A small desk sat by a window, and beside it a chair. Papers were scattered, as though someone had been interrupted mid-thought. A map of India was pinned to the far wall, and on the desk lay a curious object, a scroll tube, its brass clasp open. Holmes stepped forward and opened it. Inside was a tightly rolled sheet of parchment. He unspooled it, revealing faded ink sketches, figures, names, perhaps symbols of rank, and at the bottom, a signature, Julian Frobisher. I stared. He was compiling a report. More than a report, Holmes murmured. A list, a record of those involved in the incident at Jalgan. Names, dates, possibly testimony. A document like this could unravel reputations, even destroy them. And someone wanted it stopped. Not someone. Holmes rolled the scroll up again. More than one. He turned toward the corridor. Watson, I fear we are being misled. Not toward the guilty, but away from them. The dagger, the cellar, the maid's nervousness, all diversions. This was no impulsive killing. It was silencing, planned. I hesitated. But who stands to gain? That, Holmes said, we shall soon discover. But mark my words, the person we least suspect has already told us more than they meant to. He looked back into the darkened room, and somewhere, hidden still, is the true motive. We are not chasing a murderer alone. We are chasing a secret long buried, and secrets, when unearthed, have teeth, have yaws. Holmes lingered in the threshold of the sealed study longer than I expected, his eyes raking the room once more with that peculiar, hawk-like focus I had come to know so well. Though he had already examined the desk and the scroll, it was evident to me he had not yet seen all he needed. Without a word, he stepped back into the chamber and dropped to one knee by the rug at the desk's foot. He ran his hands across the faded threads, until he found a subtle dip near the corner. Lift from this side, Watson, he said. Together we peeled the edge of the rug away, revealing a seam in the floorboards, unnatural, cut by. Holmes extracted a slender tool from his coat and slipped it into the seam. With a quiet pop, a panel lifted. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small velvet pouch, and a folded slip of parchment. Holmes took the paper first, unfolded it delicately, and read it in silence. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He returned the paper to the compartment and instead examined the pouch's contents. It held 3 items, a monocle, a brass key, and a tarnished lapel pin, in the shape of a serpent entwined with a sword. Holmes held the pin to the lamplight and turned it slowly. Symbolic, he murmured, but not military, not precisely, possibly a fraternal order, or something adjacent. He turned to me suddenly. Watson, say nothing of this. Not to Lestrade, not to Lestrade, not to Ashcroft, not yet. You're hiding something, I said, not accusingly, but because I could no longer deny the widening gulf between what Holmes was seeing and what the rest of us were permitted to glimpse. I am observing restraint, he replied coolly. This case is more than murder. It is a mirror, angled deliberately to mislead. I must know who placed it so. He tucked the pin and key into his coat and left the room without another word. I followed, bewildered but unwilling to press further. As we reached the gallery, Holmes paused before a portrait of a younger Percival Ashcroft, his expression composed, hand resting on a hilted saber. Holmes stared at it a moment, then spoke, almost to himself. Every family has ghosts. Some are inherited, others invite. We descended to the parlor where Lestrade and Ashcroft waited, the former fidgeting with his cuffs, the latter seated stiffly with a brandy he had not touched. I trust you've discovered something useful, Ashcroft asked, trying for nonchalance. Indeed, Holmes said, without elaboration. Mr. Lestrade, I recommend you interview the housekeeper again, Mrs. Holloway. Ask whether anything from the East Wing has gone missing in recent weeks. Small items, decorative or ceremonial, possibly of Indian origin. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You believe theft's involved? I believe knowledge is, Holmes replied. Ashcroft straightened slightly. If you suspect theft, Mr. Holmes, you needn't be delicate. The house has suffered no recent break-in. No, Holmes said, but it has suffered incursions. He turned, suddenly brisk. Watson, come,
As we stepped into the hall once more, I leaned closer. Holmes, why question the housekeeper about missing trinkets when we've already found the dagger? Because the dagger was planted, he said. Too conspicuous, too cleanly timed. You suspect someone staged it deliberately. I suspect someone wanted to bury the true motive in the soil of superstition, and to misdirect our attention toward Pierre. That in itself is a clue. We crossed into the conservatory once more, where the ferns had begun to wilt under the strain of neglect. Mr. Godwin remained in the corner, still wrapped in his shawl, humming faintly under his breath. Holmes approached him with quiet gravity. "Mr. Godwin," he said, "I believe you've seen more than you've said." The old man opened one eye. "I see many things, sir. Some I dream, some I remember, and some I'm not allowed to forget." Holmes knelt beside him. "The night Julian Frobisher died, did you pass through the east wing?" Godwin's humming ceased. "A forbidden wing, but not locked. Did you see anyone?" Godwin nodded slowly. "A shape, tall, dark coat, the smell of ink and matches. He moved like a man who knew the weight of guilt. I watched him pass like smoke, and he never saw me." Holmes's voice dropped a tone. "Did he see Mr. Frobisher?" The old man's gaze was suddenly sharp. He was waiting for him. Holmes studied him a moment longer, then rose. "You've been helpful." Godwin smiled faintly. "Be careful, detective. Some riddles unravel the mind." We returned to the hallway in silence. Holmes's pace quickened as we ascended once more to the main stair. "The smell of ink and matches," he repeated. "A writer, a smoker, and someone who knew the house." I ventured. "Frobisher was the only known writer among them." "No," Holmes said. "He was the researcher, but the one who feared what he might publish. That man is our shadow." He entered the drawing room once more, and requested to see Frobisher's personal effect. Ashcroft, looking increasingly weary, sent a footman to retrieve a small case from the guest room. Holmes opened it methodically. Inside were papers, a worn journal, and a portable typewriter. He flipped through the journal, frowning, then stopped on a blank page. "No impressions," he murmured. "Strange. A man in the habit of recording everything, yet these last pages are untouched." He turned to the typewriter and began examining the ribbon. After several moments, he plucked it out and held it to the light, his eyes sharpening. "Watson," he said, "fetch me a mirror and a bottle of iodine from your bag." I complied, puzzled. Holmes applied the iodine delicately to a thin sheet of paper, then pressed it against the used ribbon. Slowly, as the chemicals reacted, faint letters emerged, typewritten impressions too light to read directly, now revealed in ghostly rows. Holmes squinted. Here, the serpent's oath was broken the moment Ashcroft signed. Names altered, interpreter silenced. Godwin no. He exhaled slowly. That's why Frobisher was killed. Not because he was writing a book, because he was unearthing a betrayal, one that involved not just Ashcroft, but others. Then who, I asked, if not Ashcroft himself, who had both access and motive? Holmes, someone with enough knowledge to forge, to plant, and to deflect. Someone whose name Frobisher never wrote in full, but someone Godwin remembered. He slipped the paper into his coat and turned toward the door. "And now, Watson, I must ask you to wait. There is one last conversation I must have alone. If I'm right, the game is nearly at its end." He vanished into the corridor, leaving me staring after him with a mix of admiration and unease. Holmes had found the secret clue, of that I was certain, but what he meant to do with it, and whom he now suspected, remained as veiled as the London fog beyond the glass. Holmes disappeared through the west corridor, his coat flaring slightly, as he vanished into the shadows of Ashcroft House, with the swiftness of a man following a scent only he could perceive. I stood for a moment in the drawing room, surrounded by the echoes of secret. Frobisher's final lines clung to my mind. The serpent's oath was broken. Godwin knows. A low chime rang through the hall, the grandfather clock announcing 11:30. The house had fallen into a tense quiet, with staff lingering at doorways and Lestrade prowling like a terrier on a short leash. I paced restlessly, the weight of uncertainty settling over me, like the thick London fog I could see curling at the edges of the tall windows. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When Holmes returned, there was something different about him. His movements more abrupt, his silence weightier. He removed his gloves, and flung them onto a chair. "You're troubled," I said quietly. He did not meet my eye. "I've spoken with the only person left who could confirm my suspicion, and they did." "Then we've reached the end," Holmes finally looked at me. No, we've reached the threshold, and beyond it lies a second crime, one that, if left unchecked, will succeed where the first has failed. I stepped closer. Another murder. He shook his head. Worse, a cleansing, the destruction of truth. Before I could ask what he meant, the butler entered in haste. Mr. Holmes, Captain Ashcroft requests you at once. There's been some. We followed him back toward the main gallery, where Lestrade was already striding toward the base of the stair. Upstairs he barked. One of the guest rooms. The older man, Ambrose Godwin. He's collapsed. We found Godwin half reclined on the chaise in his room, his skin pale as wax, lips tinged blue. The maid who had found him was trembling beside the window. A discarded teacup shattered on the floor near her feet. Holmes knelt swiftly. I checked the pulse. Faint, barely discernible. Opium, Holmes murmured, sniffing the rim of a second cup on the bedside table. Laced heavily. Not enough for immediate death, but soon, if left untreated. Suicide? Lestrade asked, grim-faced. Holmes's mouth thinned. Ambrose Godwin has lived with madness long enough not to fear it. This was meant to silence him. I sprang into motion, directing a footman to fetch the household physician, and requesting vinegar and mustard powder from the kitchen. As we worked to rouse the old man, Holmes remained at the foot of the bed, still as stone. Bed, still as stone. Bed, still as...
Watson, he said under his breath, you must stay with him. Do not leave him alone, even for a moment. I'll see to it. Holmes vanished once more, his movements now charged with urgency. I remained by Godwin's side, applying compresses, keeping his head elevated, forcing small sips of water between his lips. He stirred once, muttering disjointed words, mirror, snake's promise, red moon, before lapsing into a shallow, twitching sleep. Nearly an hour passed before Holmes returned. This time he was breathless. I've found the missing piece, he said, voice low but fierce. Not an object, but a person. I stared. Who? Someone not officially listed among the guests. Someone who arrived unannounced and remained invisible except to those who knew what to look for. A name buried among footmen, housemaids and cousins. He registered under the name Elliot Ward. But I found a correspondence tucked behind a false panel in the east wing desk. He held out a folded note already yellowing but the script legible. I read, to Ashcroft, your silence is required. The Brotherhood endures. The records must remain sealed. I will oversee Frobisher's withdrawal if you lack resolve. E. I looked up. This Elliot Ward is one of them. Holmes nodded. More than that, he's their agent. A man of many names. Formerly a junior attaché in Delhi, dismissed quietly, reappeared under various aliases across 3 continents, always circling the same names, the same old guilt. I suspect he followed Frobisher here, not to learn what he knew but to destroy it. Where is he now? That's the question, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. He's disappeared, slipped from the house sometime in the last hour, possibly with the scroll, possibly with something worse. He turned toward the door, and now the final stage begins. Before I could stop him, he strode toward the main hall and summoned Ashcroft, Lestrade and the senior staff into the drawing room. The atmosphere was brittle with confusion and fear. Holmes stood before the hearth like a barrister ready to argue for a soul. This house, he said, has hosted more than a murder. It has hosted a reckoning. Julian Frobisher's death was no crime of passion. It was premeditated, carefully, almost reverently. He was silenced not because of who he was, but because of what he knew. He faced Ashcroft directly. You may not have ordered his death, Captain, but you built the fortress in which the secret hid. Ashcroft's jaw tightened. You go too far. Not far enough, Holmes replied coldly. Frobisher unearthed the Jalgan records. Godwin confirmed their truth. Pierce discovered the relic meant to frighten us off the trail. But the dagger, the riddle, even the scroll, they are decoy. The true danger lies in the man who watched it all, who moved freely between rooms and who has now vanished. Elliot Ward, your shadow, the one who whispered threats into your conscience and poison into your guest's cup. Lestrade stepped forward. And what do you propose we do? Lock the house, Holmes said flatly. Search every corridor, every passage. There are hiding places yet unexplored. And if he's gone, Holmes's eyes were like flint. Then we must pray what he took does not reach the world outside. As Lestrade moved to give orders, I approached Holmes quietly. Is it really that grave? Holmes nodded. The scroll contained names of those who swore a secret pact during the Jalgan affair. Men who executed an innocent to preserve their own career. If it falls into the wrong hands, it will not bring justice, it will bring chaos. A wave of discredit and reaction. Possibly even retaliation from quarters eager to expose the Empire's sins. And you believe Ward intends to use it, or sell it to those who will, he said. Either path ends in blood. At that moment a commotion erupted near the east wing. A shout, the sound of scuffling, then a crash of glass. Holmes bolted toward it with me behind him. We arrived to find a shattered window, shards scattered across the marble. Outside, through the fog, a figure sprinted across the lawn, long coat flapping. Holmes darted forward without hesitation, vaulting over the sill and into the mist. I hesitated only a moment before following. We pursued the figure, across the garden, our steps muffled by the sodden earth. Twice he glanced back, and I saw just enough of his face, pinched, narrow, eyes hollow with purpose. He reached the iron gate and wrenched it open. Holmes ahead of me now, shouted, "Ward, stop." The man turned but only to raise a small pistol. A shot rang out, sharp and sudden. Holmes flinched, stumbled, then regained his footing. Lestrade's voice roared from behind us. "Police, drop your weapon." But Ward was gone, swallowed by the night. Holmes clutched his arm. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against the cuff of his coat. I reached him just in time to catch him as he staggered. "It's nothing," he muttered. "A graze. You're bleeding. I've bled for less. But we have his scent now, Watson. He's desperate. And desperation leaves footprints." I looked down the road, where the fog rolled endlessly. Holmes was hurt. Godwin was barely breathing. And a killer now hunted not for sport but to erase history itself. The stakes had risen, and we had only just begun. Back at Ashcroft House, Holmes refused all suggestions that he lie down or seek medical attention beyond the quick bandaging I had insisted on. The bullet had only grazed his upper arm, though it had torn through his coat and left a shallow gash. I cleaned the wound myself in the drawing room, under the dim glow of a gas sconce, while Holmes, still sharp despite the blood loss, murmured to himself in clipped fragments. I could scarcely follow. He rose as soon as I secured the bandage, flexing the arm experimentally. "Still useful," he said with a dry smile. "Though Ward's aim leaves much to be desired." "Yours doesn't," I said pointedly. "You nearly collapsed after that sprint, which only means he thinks I'm out of commission. Let's not disabuse him of the notion." Before I could question him further, Holmes strode to the fireplace and pulled the bell cord. When the butler appeared, Holmes instructed that a footman be sent immediately to the nearby post office, with an urgent telegram. He handed over a folded slip of paper and a sovereign without explaining its content. "You're sending for help?" I asked. "Reinforcement of a kind," he said, "but not from Scotland Yard." He turned away and crossed to the writing desk, withdrawing a bundle of aged letters, the ones retrieved from the hidden study, and spread them across the surface. "Ward has the scroll, I've no doubt of that, but he doesn't yet have everything. There's something else he needs, something he expected to find here, and when it eluded him, he panicked." "Another document?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No. A key, and not a metaphorical one." I followed his gaze to his coat, draped over a nearby chair. From its pocket he drew the small brass key found with the serpent pin in the hidden compartment earlier. He held it up, turning it in the gaslight. "Frobisher's scroll is a piece of the puzzle. This key, whatever it opens, completes the picture, and Ward knows he doesn't have." "But does he know you do?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That's the question we shall answer tonight." He crossed to Lestrade, who stood by the door conferring with two constables. "Inspector, I must ask that you increase the watch on the manor. Double the patrols, but make them visible. Let Ward believe we are more concerned with keeping him out than keeping him unaware. You think he'll return? He must. That scroll is valuable, yes, but it is not sufficient. He needs whatever lies behind this key." "Any idea what that is?" Lestrade asked. "None. Yet." Holmes's eyes flicked to the hallway. "But I intend to draw him close enough to tell me." By midnight Ashcroft House had fallen into a state of uneasy quiet.
Godwin was resting under the care of the household physician, still semi-conscious. His color improved. Lestrade took up a position near the conservatory while 2 constables patrolled the grounds. Holmes had taken to pacing the east wing, always just out of direct sight, his movements calculated, distracted, even erratic. He muttered to himself in louder tones than usual, let doors swing noisily, and once I caught him knocking over a chair deliberately before righting it with a sheepish grin. "You're putting on a show," I whispered as I helped him adjust his bandage again. "Precise." Ward must see a man unraveling under pressure, desperate, clutching at threads. He won't strike unless he believes his opponent is exposed, and when he does, then the web tightens. He gestured for me to follow. We descended into the cellar, this time by the servants' stair, moving quietly along the passageway that led to the wine vault. Holmes inspected the latch again, then turned to a low arch at the far end, a narrow recess I hadn't noticed before. "There's a tunnel here." He's blocked, but not sealed. Pierce mentioned it in passing, a remnant from the older design of the house. Likely a tradesman's entrance or an escape passage. If Ward has explored the estate, he may know of it. He stepped closer to the wall, pressing against the stone. One, near the base, gave slightly beneath his hand. A hollow panel. "Good," he said. "Watson, stay here. Watch this entrance. Do not move unless I call. If Ward returns, it will be through here. And where will you be?" "Where he can see me, but not where he can reach me." He disappeared up the stair again, and I settled into the cold shadows of the cellar arch, revolver in hand, my breath quiet but tense. For nearly an hour I waited. Then I heard it, the faintest scrape of metal on stone. I held my breath. A figure moved through the darkness, slowly, deliberately. I saw only the silhouette at first, then the glint of lamplight on a blade. It was Ward. He did not notice me, his attention fixed on the arch. He paused there, crouched, and began to manipulate the false panel. Holmes had shown me. I stepped forward silently, gun raised. "Stop where you are." He froze. "Turn around." Slowly. He rose, very carefully, hands up. His face was thinner than I remembered, eyes deeper set, features composed but tense. "You've got nerve," he said. "I've got orders," I replied, "and a very short fuse." He offered a slight smile. "Then perhaps I should talk quickly." We heard movement above, the creak of a step, the rustle of fabric. "Too late," Holmes called down. "He's seen enough." Holmes descended, flanked by Lestrade and 2 constables. Ward took one look at the key in Holmes's hand and exhaled. "I see," he said. "You baited me." Holmes nodded. "With truth. And a false trail. You never had the full scroll, only a summary, one left behind to tempt you. The original never left this house." Ward's eyes darkened. "Then you've doomed more than me." "Perhaps," Holmes said. "But that's not for you to decide." Ward moved suddenly, hand darting for his coat, but Lestrade was faster. He seized him, forcing the man against the stone wall as the constables restrained him. "I'll say nothing," Ward hissed. "Not here. You already have," Holmes said coldly, "and it's more than enough." They led Ward away in silence, and I turned to Holmes. "You lied about the scroll." "I lied about many things," he said, "including how badly I was wounded." He flexed his arm with a grimace. "It hurts like the devil, but it did the trick." We climbed the steps together, the quiet of the house returning around us. Ward was in custody. Godwin would recover. Ashcroft stood in the upper hall, watching us with something like guilt in his expression. Holmes passed him without a word. We reached the study. Holmes closed the door behind us, and finally allowed himself to sag into a chair. He removed the serpent pin and brass key from his coat and placed them on the desk. "One piece remains," he said quietly, "and tomorrow, we'll see where this key fits." He turned to me with a weariness I had seldom seen. "Tonight was about misdirection, but tomorrow must be about revelation. The truth still lies waiting, Watson, and it will not stay buried forever." Holmes sat at the writing desk, still as a statue, his long fingers interlaced beneath his chin. The serpent pin and brass key lay before him, unmoved since the night before. His gaze was fixed not on them but somewhere far beyond the room, as though seeing the invisible threads of a puzzle finally knotted into shape. I entered quietly, having risen early to check on Mr. Godwin, who had roused at last and asked, in a whisper, whether the serpent had found its tail. I told him yes, though I did not yet understand what that meant. Holmes did not look at me as I approached. "It's time," he said simply. I nodded. "They're waiting." Lestrade, Captain Ashcroft, the senior staff, and a visibly shaken Reginald Pierce were gathered in the parlor. The air was thick with apprehension, the sort born not of fear for what might happen, but dread over what has already occurred. Holmes entered, and took his place by the fireplace. He did not pace or gesture. He stood very still, and when he began to speak, his voice was quiet, deliberate. The death of Julian Frobisher was not an accident, nor the product of sudden violence. It was an execution, planned, calculated, executed by a man trained in the art of remaining unseen. Lestrade shifted. "You refer to Elliot Ward?" "Yes," Holmes said, "but he was not alone in motive, only in action. This case, gentlemen, has always been about a secret, a pact made in the shadow of war, and a betrayal buried beneath medals and silence." He turned to Captain Ashcroft. "You told us the affair in Jalgon ended with the execution of a suspected traitor, an interpreter accused of passing information to local rebels. What you failed to mention was that the accusation was made to cover the errors of British officers whose arrogance caused unnecessary deaths. The interpreter, Subadar Amal Jadhav, was innocent. He was sacrificed to preserve reputations." Ashcroft said nothing. His face was pale, his lips a tight line. "Julian Frobisher," Holmes continued, "was not merely a guest. He was the son of one of Jadhav's surviving relatives, raised in England, educated and determined to uncover the truth. He infiltrated your social circles under the guise of writing a historical memoir, but he was collecting testimony, documents, even artifacts, and he found them, here." He gestured to the brass key. "This opens a chest in the Ashcroft family vault beneath Albans Parish, a chest containing Jadhav's final letter, which was smuggled out by Ambrose Godwin before the execution. Godwin, then a junior officer, tried to intervene. He failed and the guilt fractured his mind, but his memory remained intact. That is why he spoke in riddles, his truth too dangerous to voice plainly." He paused. The silence was absolute. "Ward was sent to stop Frobisher, not by you, Captain Ashcroft, but by a man who feared exposure even more, a fellow signatory to the false deposition. Ward was hired to retrieve the scroll and ensure that no surviving witness could ever contradict the official record. And Godwin," I asked, "targeted, silenced with poison, though not fatally thanks to your intervention." Pierce stepped forward, voice unsteady. "But the dagger, the cellar, how does it fit?" Holmes turned. "You found the dagger behind the study, because Ward planted it there, to direct suspicion toward you. He wanted confusion. He needed it, because the truth, if glimpsed too clearly, would lead only to him." Lestrade asked, "And what of the scroll? Do we have it?" Holmes opened his coat and withdrew a sealed document, wrapped in oilskin. "We do. Ward believed he stole the original, but what he took was a decoy copied from Frobisher's note. The real scroll was hidden in the base of the desk in the old study, along with the pin and key." He handed it to Lestrade. "I recommend it be delivered to the Foreign Office, with a full account." Ashcroft finally spoke, his voice low. "You mean to destroy what's left of—"
"No," Holmes said. "I mean to restore what should never have been buried. You cannot build an honorable empire on falsehood." There was a long, cold silence. Holmes turned away, gathering his coat. "The case is closed. Ward will face justice. The scroll will be read, and the truth, however belated, will be known." As we walked toward the door, Pierce approached me and said softly, "He saved more than a life. He saved a name." I nodded, not knowing what to say, not knowing what to say, not knowing. Outside, the fog had lifted at last, and the sun broke faintly through the clouds. Holmes stood with his collar upturned, staring out across the lawn. "You admire Frobisher," I said. "I admire conviction," he replied. "He sought justice through intellect, not violence. He gave his life for a truth others buried for comfort." We descended the steps to where the cab waited. As we climbed in, I asked, "What of the Brotherhood, the others who signed the deposition?" Holmes glanced sideways. "Some are dead. Some will be exposed. But the scroll, Watson, that is no mere parchment. It is a reckoning." He closed his eyes as the carriage pulled away from Ashcroft House. the last secrets of Jalgan slowly dissolving into the morning light. The return to Baker Street was a quiet one. Holmes did not speak during the journey, though I could tell from the fine tension in his posture that his mind was far from idle. The fingers of his right hand tapped restlessly against the window pane, matching the rhythm of the horse's hooves as the cab made its slow progress through the waking streets of London. The city, wrapped in the silvery stillness of early morning, seemed untroubled by the truths that had surfaced hours before at Ashcroft House. When we finally climbed the familiar steps to Hudson greeted us with her customary fussing, expressing horror at the state of Holmes's coat and an audible sigh of relief to see him intact. He offered her a weary nod and retreated into the sitting room, shedding his garments with little ceremony before settling into his armchair by the fire. I joined him with 2 cups of strong tea and placed the morning papers on the side table, though neither of us reached for them. The silence stretched until I could bear it no longer. "You've done a great thing, Holmes." He did not look at me. "Have you prevented a murder from becoming an erasure?" I said. Frobisher's death might have disappeared into the shadows, along with the names he uncovered. Now justice has a chance to speak. Holmes took the tea but did not drink it, his eyes fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. "Justice, yes. But not absolution. You doubt that Ward will face consequences." "He will," Holmes said flatly. "Lestrade has already informed me the Crown intends to press charges: espionage, conspiracy, possibly attempted murder. But Elliot Ward was merely the blade. The hand that held it remains, for the moment, untouched." "You mean the other signatories?" "Yes. Frobisher's scroll names 3 men still alive and active in government. The scroll will be scrutinized, debated, likely suppressed in part. They will delay, discredit, dress the truth in official phrases until the shape is blurred beyond recognition." I frowned. Then what was the point? Holmes finally turned to me, and his expression was not unkind. "The point, Watson, was that it was uncovered. That somewhere, someday, someone will find that same scroll in an archive or footnote and ask why those names were hidden. The point is that a man died trying to reveal a lie, and now that lie cannot be repeated so easily." I nodded, though a quiet unease remained with me. We sat in silence for a while longer, until a knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram tray. Holmes took the single envelope without comment, and opened it. His eyes flicked across the words, then he passed it to me. "Ward in custody. Formal charges filed. Scroll in secure holding. Godwin recovering. Ashcroft not contesting. Lestrade." I exhaled slowly. "So it's done." Holmes did not reply. He rose and began moving about the room, straightening papers, rearranging books on the shelf with unnecessary care. "Something troubles you still," I said. He paused by the mantel. "Ambrose Godwin. You don't believe he'll recover?" "Oh, he will recover," Holmes said, "but what remains of him will be less than it was. He held on to that truth for decades, Watson. In riddles and fragments, he preserved what memory could not voice. That is a terrible burden. I considered that, and yet he endured." "Yes," Holmes said quietly, "perhaps more than any of us. In a house filled with power, it was the madman who remembered what honor looked like." He returned to his chair and this time sipped his tea. The fire crackled quietly. Outside, the rattle of a cart echoed on Baker Street, and the calls of street vendors filtered up from the curb. "Will you write this one?" Holmes asked suddenly. I looked at him. "You mean publish it?" "I mean record it. The full account, unvarnished." I hesitated. "You know I'll have to change the names." "Change them," he said, "but don't soften them." There was something in his voice, an unusual gravity, not bitterness, but a quiet demand that the world not be allowed to forget. I rose, fetched my pen and notebook, and sat at the desk. As the scratch of ink began to fill the room, I glanced over at him once more. There was a line Godwin said. "The night he nearly died," I said. "Do you remember? The serpent's oath was broken the moment Ashcroft signed." Holmes nodded. "A poetic truth. The serpent, a symbol of knowledge, of danger. The oath, an agreement to silence, broken the moment it was. And yet he chose to stay in the house of the man who signed it. Because even the betrayed sometimes seek to forgive," Holmes said. or to understand. I made a note of that. There was a kind of peace that settled on the room then, not one of victory, but of recognition. The case had not ended in triumph, nor in tragedy. It had ended in illumination, the sort Holmes preferred least, because it offered no pleasure, only the dull ache of justice arriving late. Still I wrote, and Holmes sat, the firelight casting long shadows behind him, as though the past itself lingered just beyond reach. "Tell me," I asked at last, "what would you have done if Ward had escaped with the scroll?" Holmes looked into the flames. "I would have hunted him," he said, "and not for the sake of the law, for Frobisher." He fell silent again, and the rest of the day passed, with only the quiet rhythm of the city and the steady turn of my pages, as I recorded what I could of a truth hard won and half saved. The late afternoon sun slanted across the sitting room of 21D Baker Street, casting long gold and amber patterns on the carpet. The fire had burned down to a warm glow, and Holmes sat with his violin resting loosely beneath his chin, the bow idle in his lap. He had not played since returning from Ashcroft House, and though the instrument was nestled in his arms with familiar intimacy, no music emerged. The room felt suspended, as if even time had stopped to consider what had passed. I finished the final lines of my account, folded the manuscript, and set it gently aside. Holmes had read nothing I'd written so far. He never asked to, and I never offered until the case was well and truly closed. "Do you think Lestrade will carry it through?" I asked after a long silence. Holmes plucked a single string, letting it hum. "He will do what the machinery allows," he said, "but even he understands now that truth cannot always be neatly filed and sealed. Too many of the players in this story are beyond his reach, or perhaps beyond anyone." "You speak as if the case is not yet over." "In a technical sense, it is," Holmes replied, adjusting the violin slightly. "Ward is in custody. The scroll is safe. Godwin lives. Frobisher is avenged. But that is not what I measure. I wait. I measure by what remains," he said, at last drawing the bow across the strings, softly, once. "And what remains is the scar." He let the music trail off, before it ever truly began. "I suppose that's why you chose not to expose Ashcroft publicly," I said. "Because the scar was punishment enough, perhaps. Or perhaps I wanted the living to reflect more deeply than the dead ever could. Guilt can teach, Watson, if it is allowed to breathe." He set the violin down and reached for his pipe instead, striking a match and drawing in the smoke slowly, as though it steadied his thoughts. "Do you believe Ward truly acted alone? In function, yes," Holmes said. "In principle, he was the hand of a network, fragments of forgotten loyalties, vestiges of a time when England ruled by secrecy as much as force. What he tried to do wasn't only about erasing a document, it was about ensuring no one would ever believe the document mattered." I thought of Frobisher again, the look on his face as described in Miss Wren's testimony, quiet, composed, but burdened by something larger than even he could carry. His death had sent a ripple through time that none of us could yet fully measure. "You said he was trying to restore a name," I murmured, "and that he died for it. But in the end, do you think it will change anything?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. "It might change one thing," he said, "and sometimes one thing is enough. A man's honor, long buried, may be spoken of again. A young scholar might read his name in the footnotes of history and wonder why it was struck out for so long. Perhaps someone will look harder and find the rest." We sat a while in the quiet, and then I ventured a question I had carried with me since the case's beginning. "When did you first suspect that Ward wasn't merely a guest, but something else?" Holmes smiled faintly. "From the moment Captain Ashcroft told us the crime had no witnesses, save for a madman who spoke in riddles. That early. Madmen do not speak in rhyme without rhythm. Godwin's verse was structured, poetic, yes, but with layers of symbolism that suggested a trained mind, hiding behind lunacy, and those who fear what the mad remember are usually those who can't afford to be remembered." He leaned back. "Once I confirmed Godwin had indeed served at Jalgon, the rest became a matter of following the silent. Who benefited most by keeping him quiet, who moved through the house unseen, and who reacted, not with shock but with control? Ward. Exactly. He hid by pretending to be unremarkable, an extra guest, a name in the ledger, no one questioned. But I always question the names no one questions." The sun dipped lower, and the lamplighter passed by on the street below.
Holmes watched him for a moment, then spoke again. You should publish this one in full, Watson. You're certain, even with the names changed. Let people read between the lines if they must. What matters is that they know the lines exist. He rose slowly and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. His silhouette was cast long across the floor, stretched by the last remnants of the day. You asked me once what I would have done had Ward escaped with the scroll, he said. I nodded. You said you would have hunted him. I meant it, not out of vengeance, but because some truths do not belong to those who seek to erase them. I stood beside him, watching the glow of lamps flicker across the rooftops. Will you rest now? I asked. He tilted his head slightly. Rest, yes, but not idle. There are always more puzzles, Watson, and too often, the greatest ones are not found in locked rooms or blood-stained studies, but in the choices men make when no one is watching. He turned from the window and met my gaze. But for tonight, he added, let us leave the riddles behind. He returned to his chair, took up the violin once more, and this time played not a march or a sonata, but a quiet melody, reflective and uncertain, a tune without resolution. It filled the room, not with answers, but with the solemn grace of something understood too late. I sat back and listened, the final lines of my manuscript still fresh in my mind. The fire crackled, the fog returned, and Sherlock Holmes, my friend, my companion in truth, played into the night, while the ghosts of Ashcroft House at last began to fade. The rain had come softly during the night, and by morning a gentle mist lingered above the cobblestones of Baker Street, curling about the iron railings and dissolving into the brick. Inside 21B, the fire crackled with renewed vigor, and Holmes stood by the window sipping the last of his Turkish coffee, while I reviewed the final galley proofs of my account of the case. He had been peculiarly quiet since the manuscript's completion, not out of dissatisfaction, but a meditative stillness I had seen only in the aftermath of cases that left moral residue rather than professional triumph. He had solved the mystery, unraveled the and yet, there had been no theatrical flourish, no courtroom drama, no moment of thunderous applause from Scotland Yard, only the slow, irreversible churning of consequences set in motion. It is an odd thing, I said, not looking up from the pages, to close the account of a case and feel no real sense of closure. Holmes turned from the window. That is because it hasn't truly closed. You mean Ward? Ward will be tried, of that I am confident, Holmes said. But the truth, what Frobisher died to uncover, is not a matter for trial, it is a matter for history. He set his cup down and crossed the room, retrieving from the shelf the false scroll Ward had tried so desperately to secure. Though it was a forgery, crafted from Frobisher's notes and a few deliberate insertions Holmes had made to render it traceable, it was accurate enough to bait the trap. The real document had already been transferred to a solicitor's office in Lambeth, with instructions that it be released to a parliamentary oversight committee if anything were to happen to Godwin, or indeed to us. Do you think they'll act on it? I asked. Or bury it deep? Holmes shrugged. They may do both. Release a name or two, let the rest fade behind parliamentary privilege. But as I told you before, Watson, the truth now exists in more than one place. It cannot be undone. That is the only justice a man like Frobisher could ever win. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note on a silver tray, her face carefully composed. I recognized the wax seal, a crest bearing a coiled serpent and crossed quills. Holmes opened it without haste, eyes scanning the neat handwriting. When he was done, he handed it to me. It read, Mr. Holmes, please accept my gratitude. Though my reputation lies in tatters, I find myself lighter for the loss. The scroll may yet survive to speak for those whose voices were denied. Godwin is being transferred to a home near the coast. He prefers solitude now, but I believe he knows peace. There is one final thing in the cellar of Ashcroft House. Beneath the panel where you found the dagger, there is another compartment. I never opened it. I believe it is yours to discover. P. Ashcroft. Holmes's mouth twitched slightly. It would seem the house still has secrets. You intend to return? Not immediately, but someday perhaps. He took the note back and slipped it into the pages of his index of unsolved cases, now considerably lighter. Let the dead rest a while longer. We sat then in the comfortable quiet of old familiarity, interrupted only by the distant clatter of hooves and the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes lit his pipe and stared at the ceiling, lost in whatever chain of deductions or distractions sustained his ever-turning mind. I studied the final paragraph of my manuscript again, tweaking a sentence for rhythm, then closing the folio. You know, I said, There's a part of me that still doesn't quite believe Frobisher came so far alone. He must have known what would happen. He did, Holmes replied, but he also believed quite stubbornly that truth deserved to be risked. Perhaps that is a kind of madness, or perhaps it is the only form of sanity left in a world run by polite lies. And you, what do you believe? Holmes glanced at me, then looked away. I believe Frobisher succeeded. It was not the answer I expected, but it settled over the room like a final note in a symphony. Nothing more needed to be said. Later that evening, Holmes retired early, claiming the need to disengage from the moral complications of modern governance. I remained behind, reorganizing our files. As I replaced the leather-bound volume containing the Ashcroft affair, I noticed a loose sheet tucked between its pages. Holmes's handwriting, sharp and precise. It read, "In the matter of Frobisher, Ashcroft and Ward, the criminal sought to erase a name, the detective preserved a fact, but it was the poet, the madman who held the meaning." When I finally turned down the lamp and retired for the night, the city was quiet beyond our window. The fog had returned, but it no longer seemed to press in with menace. Rather, it moved gently across the glass like a veil, something to be lifted, not feared. And somewhere beneath it, the name of a forgotten man, Subedar Amal Jadav, waited no longer for silence, but for memory. Silence,